Many of the teachers who talk about awakening or enlightenment, or self-realization, they say that it's very important to understand that unless you prepare your mind, unless you train your mind to come out of the fear-based way of being, unless you train your mind to be compassionate, unless you train your mind to be less self-centered and egotistical, unless you train your mind to be able to be calmer and more relaxed, that meditation will be a very difficult practice for people. And that's why in many of the Eastern traditions, they don't begin to teach meditation until many years after the mind training process, learning about the mind and practicing paying attention to the different emotional states and the different states of mind and thought processes and patterns, and paying attention to the conditioning and working to change that to a more negative mind state, so that when you begin to practice meditation, it's not so uncomfortable and not so difficult to be there and be aware of these negative thoughts and these fearful experiences and so forth. This is what turns a lot of people off when it comes to meditation. In fact, one of the teachers that I was listening to recently, this guy Don Brown, he did an interview with Ian, this person who does a thing called Conscious TV out of the UK. And I sent out a link to his website now because he is now offering a lot of teaching and so forth. But he's a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and he's a very highly trained teacher in several of the forms of meditation and Buddhism. And in this interview, he was saying that in our Western culture, in our Western society, the approach to training people to prepare them to practice meditation could be spoken of in terms of psychotherapy. You know, that in the East, they don't call it psychotherapy, they call it mind training. There's a lot of ways that they describe it, but basically it's a relationship with a teacher that meets with you on a regular basis and begins to point out to you how your mind is working and how it's deceiving you and how your mind is functioning in a particular way in which it's fear-based and in which it's craving and desiring and avoiding whatever appears before it. So it's in a survival state. And through this interaction with this other person and this dialogue, you're educated about the nature of your mind, and you're being trained to pay attention in such a way where you literally start to change these things. You begin to practice compassion and being of service. Whether you understand it thoroughly or not, you begin to practice it. It's part of the training. Why? Because it's selflessness. You know, to be of service to people and have their welfare be more important than yours is a form of being selfless. And to have compassion and understand the impact of ignorance on other people as you're learning about your own ignorance and starting to change the way your mind works through these interactions with the teacher and through these practices. And then at a certain point, you're more able to meditate because you've trained your mind to settle down. You've trained your mind to follow what you intended to do and to begin to work consistently with what you're up to as far as waking up is concerned. Because in reality, you know, as many teachers have said, you could talk about the true nature of the self as being like the sun that is always radiating its light. And at the level from the ground level, as one teacher was saying yesterday that I was listening to, he said he was taking his sons on a school vacation, and they were in Boston, and there was a snowstorm, and he only had a certain number of days where his sons were going to be available to go on vacation with him. So they went to the airport, and all the flights were canceled. But then he was able to locate one flight that was going to take off, and so they got on that plane. And he said they weren't sure whether the plane was going to make it to take off because it was snowing so hard they had to de-ice the plane several times before it tried to take off. And he said, but after it took off, once it got above the clouds, the sky was blue and the sun was shining. And on the ground level, there was a heavy snowstorm and wind going on. And he said that's really an analogy of the nature of the self. The self is always there, always shining. The difference between that particular example and the way it is for us is that in that case, the sun was above the clouds, above the cloud cover. In our case, the sun isn't above the cloud cover. The sun is the actuality of what you are. The cloud cover is the state of mind and the negative emotions and the fear that are obscuring this radiant light, which is always there. So this is why it's important to do work on understanding how, because the thing about the service and being selfless and practicing compassion and so forth is that it's very important to understand that the you who begins this process, this journey, whatever you want to call it, cannot possibly succeed in being self-realized, cannot possibly succeed in being enlightened. Even though in the beginning of the process, you can't shake that off. It's just the case that the understanding you have of who you are, the identification with who you have it that you are, desires to be enlightened, desires to be free. However, the reason for practicing compassion and selflessness is because that you can never possibly be enlightened and be free, because that you is not the self that can be enlightened and be free. The self that can be enlightened and be free is the same self as the self of all humanity. Therefore, the only possibility for you to be enlightened and be free is to recognize yourself as all human beings, to recognize yourself as that self that's common to all of humanity, not personal. So when you're practicing compassion and service, you're practicing not being personal. You're practicing not being self-centered. You're practicing taking care of other human beings as a way of beginning to develop the understanding that they are you, that the awareness is the same for all of us. And so to really be free, the freedom is impersonal. There has to be a process of letting go of experiencing yourself as separate, experiencing yourself as personal. And that's not an easy process because you've been thoroughly conditioned to identify with yourself as separate and personal. And in the beginning of wanting to be free and be enlightened, that's the you that wants to be free and become enlightened. So that's got to be broken up. And it's not so much that there's anything that becomes enlightened or that there's a you that becomes enlightened, but by breaking up the belief that you have about what you are, by breaking up the states of mind that are associated with being a separate self and identifying with the body, by breaking that up through this process of, you could call it psychotherapy, through paying attention and seeing firsthand the true nature of the mind, the true nature of the way that you identify with the body and so forth. By breaking that up, you're breaking up the cloud cover, you see. By breaking that up, you're breaking up the cloud cover. And when you break up the cloud cover, the light starts to come through. So really, what happens when you wake up, when you become the self, when you become enlightened, it's something that happens. It's not something you do. What you do is you clear the obscurations. What you do is you change the mind, prepare the mind, open the mind. Have the mind stop dominating the experience you're having of yourself. And you do that by practicing being selfless. This practice of being selfless and being of service is an absolute necessity in the process of self-realization. Without that, there's no way. Because without that, you're still identified with being a separate self. And as long as you're identified with being a separate self, that's the block. That's the obscuration. Even when you're meditating now, when you practice meditation, you know, as many teachers have said, the idea of starting this whole process of self-realization by starting to practice meditation is a hard way to approach it, right? Because you're beginning the process with a very disturbed mind, with a very unrealistic mind, with a mind that is full of fear and full of beliefs and full of identifications with the idea that you're separate from the rest of the world, and full of identifications with the body. And that's why when people begin to sit and meditate, there's so much restlessness. There's so much of the sense of I can't do this because my mind just keeps running. And the mind will actually, you know, the more you attempt to meditate, the mind will actually speed up. It will actually work harder to keep your attention. Because unless it has your attention, unless you're thinking, then according to the way the mind works, unless you're thinking, it's a threat to your survival because who you think you are is produced by thinking. And so for people, I remember when I first attempted to meditate many, many years ago, it was very hard. Very hard. I mean, I sat there and didn't move, but the whole thing was just tolerating the experience. You know, it was just tolerating the experience. And at the time I thought to myself, if this is meditation, I can't believe anybody can do this for very long, right? That's the way it occurs for people who are brand new at meditation. And so that's why it's important to do the work, to learn to understand the nature of the mind and to learn to understand how the thought process works and to actively work on changing your mind, changing the way the mind is, understanding that the mind is set up in such a way where it will try and hold on to what it can't hold on to. It will try and avoid what it can't avoid. To begin to use your attention, to pay attention and see that as it's happening, and begin to not let the mind lead the way. To begin to have the mind start to obey your will, your intention, and gradually train it to calm down. And then when you meditate, meditation is a whole different story. You know, when I meditate now, I can actually sit still. My mind is relatively calm, and it's actually a very pleasurable experience. But that's not going to happen for most people the first time that you begin to practice. And then you do have to change. You have to change how you're being in your life. And you have to start to have compassion, and you have to start to have patience and tolerance for what's going on around you that would normally cause you to react and be upset, and start to relate to people in a way where you're more interested in what you're giving than what you're taking. It's an essential aspect of the process of waking up. And if you do that, it will help to break up some of the cloud cover, because it's a way of releasing the idea that you're stuck being separate from other people. It's a way of releasing the belief that you are different than anybody else, and understanding that we're all the same. A self-realized person sees all human beings as the same as they are. And therefore, their interest in caring for them, their interest in being of service to them is the same as their interest in caring for themselves and being in service to themselves. There's no difference. And that has to be the case for you to wake up and be self-realized, because anything other than that would not be you. It would be a personal self that was trying to personally be awake. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is an important part of this process if you're somebody who struggles when you attempt to meditate, if you find you're somebody who still has a lot of difficulty in applying these practices and these understandings in your relationships in your life, and applying these practices and understandings in managing your own experience, emotional experiences and states of mind, then you should probably consider doing some psychotherapy, to work on that, to get that loosened up, to allow you to be unstuck from these mental states and these identifications. And then you'll be able to be of service, you'll be able to see your way to contribute to the people around you, and that will break up the cloud cover and allow the light to come in, allow the experience of who you are to start to become clear. Kavish? So take a look at those videos and consider what I said, that if you find yourself, if you think that just through meditation alone that you can come into a self-realized experience, that's not true. That's not true. You have to do some work, psychological work. You have to work on your mind. You have to train your mind. You have to change your mind. You have to pay attention to it and see what it's doing, and see that what it's doing is contrary to the truth. See what it's doing is keeping you small, keeping you stuck, keeping you personal, keeping you at odds and in conflict with life and other people. And so you have to actively start to work on changing that. And it requires patience, and it requires really learning. And it really does involve having somebody to work with who can point it out to you. Because one of the problems that people have is they can't see it. They don't have insight. They're not aware of how they are unless somebody's there pointing it out to them. Okay?